In this video, I'll be discussing creating glowing objects in 3ds Max. For the video here, I'll be using 3ds Max Design 2010, although some of the concepts that I go over will also be applicable to previous versions of 3ds Max. What I'm going to start off with is a scene that you see the actual render of here. And what we'll have is some glow effects that we'll add to the bright objects here in the scene. We'll be using Mental Ray for this particular video, but I will get into some of the glow effects that are compatible with the scanline renderer as well. So in looking at the scene here, I just have a teapot and a couple of spheres, some candle holders, candlesticks, and some geometry that I've created for a flame, as well as a couple of light sources here. Now the first thing that I'll do is let's just disable these light sources. These are all instance lights, so when I cut one off, they're all going to cut off here. And what I want to look at is this self-illuminated material that I've used for this flame object. So I'll switch to a perspective view and zoom in here. And let me bring up my material editor and just grab the material picker and pull this into the material editor. What I have here is a Arc and Design material with no reflectivity and a self-illumination option enabled here. What I'll do is enable a couple of options here to try and illuminate this scene with this geometry. In order to do that, I of course have to enable this self-illumination option. And if you notice, some of the settings here are similar to the settings on the photometric lights. For example, if I wanted to use some of the photometric presets for color, I could do so here. Or I could specify a Kelvin color, or I could even use a map here and tint, use this filter to tint the color. What I want to do is set this Kelvin for around 2000 degrees here, and because that's similar to what I'm using for the photometric lights here. I have these fairly bright at 1500 candela, and by default this self-illuminated material is visible in reflections. If you didn't want it visible in reflections, you could disable that. And also you can have this illuminate the scene when using Final Gather. So what I'll do is enable that. I want to come down to my settings here for Final Gather and take a look. What I want to do is set this, I'm just going to set it for medium. Going to reduce the size of my render a little bit just so I don't have to wait so long for the results here. The reason that I increase the Final Gather amount is that when I'm using the self-illuminated material, I want to make sure that I have enough Final Gather data here to produce some light in the scene. I'm going to give this 2 Final Gather bounces, and I believe that's good. I just want to double check to make sure that I've enabled that option on the self-illumination to illuminate the scene when using Final Gather. Final Gather is enabled. Now I'll just switch back to my camera view and give this a render. Now as you can see from the rendered output, my objects are there, but there's no illumination in the scene. And the reason that it's really not illuminating the scene is because these are very small objects. You think of a candle flame, that's a very small object, and it's not practical to try and illuminate a scene with like this candle flame here using Mental Ray, at least, and these Mental Ray self-illuminated materials like this Arc and Design self-illuminated material. It's more practical to actually use light sources. So basically what this is, you should consider this self-illumination glow option kind of a representation of a light source, and not actually use it to illuminate your scenes, because it's just not as efficient as using the actual light sources and Final Gather. When you try to do this, you just won't get as much light data or efficiency out of this self-illumination option as you would an actual light source. Plus, there are some other drawbacks to trying to illuminate a scene with the self-illumination option. Let's say I did want to actually illuminate this scene. what I'll do is create a large light source here using a self-illuminated material. So I'll create a fairly large plane object, something like so. What is this? Let's make that 24 inches by 120 inches. And I'll just move this up above the objects here and create a new material, Arc & Design material. Again, I'm going to disable the reflectivity and just come down to the self-illumination options, enable that. We'll give it a Kelvin color of 3200. Set this to physical units. I'll just leave it at the default value for now, and of course make sure that I enable this illuminates the scene with final gather option. Let's give this a render. But before I do, it would help if I actually applied this material to that plane object. So now let's try this again. So as you can see, it does provide some illumination into the scene here. However, you don't have all the controls over the light that you do, say, with a standard light source or a photometric light source. You also don't have that direct light. You have to have Final Gather enabled in order to illuminate the scene like this with a self-illuminated material. With a regular light source, say if I was to put a photometric light in here, I could turn off Final Gather and I would have that direct amount of light in this scene. What I'll do, let's just say I disabled Final Gather, and if I render this I won't see anything other than reflections. You can see the reflections of those self-illuminated materials. But with Final Gather disabled, if I go back in and enable my photometric lights and render, so with only my photometric lights and no Final Gather, I have this nice direct illumination in the scene, whereas you can't get that with the self-illuminated materials. You have to use Final Gather for those to work. Another drawback is that if I was using global illumination, trying to emit photons in the scene, whether it be global illumination or caustics, the self-illuminated materials do not generate photons. Therefore, it would not work. You would not be able to emit caustic photons or GI photons from the self-illuminated materials here. And that's the same whether you're using the self-illuminated option on the Arc & Design material, or whether you're using a standard material with self-illumination. Let me close that. Whether you're using a self-illuminated standard material, which, by the way, if you're using mental ray, I would not advise you to do that, because with the Arc & Design material, it's very specific. I can set the physical units, I can set a Kelvin color, whereas with the self-illumination on the standard material, I have 0 to 100. Or I can specify a color or a map, but really you don't know what you're putting in here. You know, what is 100? What value is that as far as candelas? You don't really know. And the same would hold true if I was using something like the glow loom shader. If I had a mental ray material and applied this glow loom shader, this is the same thing, same concept applies. It has to work with Final Gather enabled in order to emit light into your scene. It will not emit photons. It will not emit caustic photons or global illumination photons. So again, if you're wanting something to glow and you're using mental ray, it's probably just best to use this self-illumination option on the Arc & Design material. Okay, all that being said, let me disable these photometric lights again and just give a quick word here on if you do have to use a self-illuminated material to try to emit some light into a scene, or you just want to for whatever reason, there is something that you can do to give a little more light in the scene. What I'll do is come back to my viewport here, or my frame buffer, put Final Gather back up at medium, and just render this again with that self-illuminated plane. Alright, what I'll do is put this into the RAM player, this original render, and what you can do to kind of add a little more light from this with the Final Gather settings is go into the Final Gather settings, and here in the advanced rollout, let me turn that back off, I hit that by accident. In the advanced rollout under noise filtering, you can set this to none. What this does is it actually blocks a little bit of light or refines some of the light. It's good to use this if you have really small light sources, or if you start getting some speckle from maybe some visible photometric lights will often cause some reflection problems and things like that. What you can do is enable this or leave it to the default of standard, but it does kill off some of the light in the scene. So if you set this to none, basically it's not going to filter out any of that Final Gather light. So now if I render this again, okay, now I'll just add this to the other channel of the RAM player, and that way we can compare between the two. And as you can see, we have more light in the image here where I have disabled that noise reduction option on Final Gather. So be sure to give that a try if you have to illuminate your scenes with some self-illuminated objects. But my whole purpose in starting off this discussion on that is that so that just because you have this self-illuminated material, that's not the same as an actual light source. And it's just a better idea probably to illuminate your scenes with actual light sources, and then use this to simulate visible light sources. But if you're in a pinch or you just want to try something to illuminate your scene, that's possible. And if you do, you be sure to set the noise filtering to none, and that'll give you a little more light out of these self-illuminated objects. Okay, with that being said, let me just come in and reset my material editor here, and I'm just going to put that back to standard and delete this object and turn on my photometric lights again. So what I want to do is just run a base render with this image the way that it is. I'm going to bump the Final Gather back down to medium since I'm using regular light sources here. I just don't need as much Final Gather. Also going to increase my render size, maybe something like so. And I'll just give this a quick render so that we'll have a base to work from. Okay, so here's the base image that we'll be working from to kind of add some glows into this image. Now what I'll be using to add is probably the best way to add a glow effect if you're using Mental Ray would be to use the glare shader. And what that is a camera shader. It's a lens output shader here. So you go to your render tab settings, scroll down to camera effects, and in the output option you'll have a glare shader. You probably already have it there listed because it's there by default. But to change some of the settings, what you do is you just drag it over to your material editor as an instance copy, and you use instance copy so that when you change something here it automatically updates everywhere else. And so you have some basic controls here. You have a quality setting, a spread, streaks, and as you would expect, the quality value will handle how much detail the glare will provide. Lower values is more of a blurry, less detailed effect, whereas a higher value, and you can only go to 4, so it's kind of like steps from 0 to 4. Spread is the spread of the glare. How large of an area do you want that glare to be? A small value will give you a very small area of glare or glow. And one of the neat features that was added to the glare shader here is this streak option. This streak option will give you kind of a, you can make a star pattern. And what happens is it uses a black and white image to kind of distort that glare. If you don't use one, it's just more of a round effect. But this glare just uses a black and white image, and you can actually see these in your, there's a glare subfolder in your materials, and there's two by default. The one that it defaults to is a star pattern, and you also have a eye streaks pattern, which will give you more of a streak effect. So you also have, in addition to this, adding the streak image here, you can weight it, whereas a higher value will just produce a very strong streak. You can weight it down to 0 and it'll go back to that kind of round shape, or somewhere in between. The resolution for glare processing, you'll want to increase this for higher resolution images. If you're rendering a small image like this, probably the default 500 would work fine, but as you increase your image size here, your image output size, you would need to increase this as well, because if you don't, it's going to get kind of blocky looking. You won't have much detail in it. And then you have an option here to replace the image with glare only, and what that does is after the render is complete, it will actually just replace the render with kind of a black and white image, although it's not black and white, it's actually color, but there is color data in it. But what it contains is only the glare areas of the render. It looks kind of like a waxy image. What I'll do is, it's easier probably seen than explained. I'll use that option here shortly. But glare, when it's applies itself to the brighter areas of a render. And so the brighter an area is, the more glare that it will have. That's why this is kind of the best way to go when trying to add glowing objects to the scene, because it's based on intensity. And the intensity comes from, if you right click somewhere with your mouse in a render, what you get is the pixel data. And as you can see, as I go up here and look in the real pixel information slot of the data that's on the screen, as I come up near that flame, you can see the candle getting brighter and actually exceeding a pixel value of 1.0. 1.0 pixel is kind of equal to 255 if you're looking at it from a 0 to 255 scale. So we're exceeding that brightness, getting very bright, and as I go up into the actual flame, you can see that it's brighter than the candle itself, than this wax material. It goes up to like 7 or 8 in here. So the what that would do is the glare would actually apply a stronger effect here to the flame, a little bit here because it goes beyond 1.0. And then when you start getting down to the pixels that are 1.0 or less in brightness, it doesn't apply glare to those areas at all. So what I'll do is come back to my glare shader here, and I'll just leave the quality up. I'll just leave that at 4. For the spread, I'll just leave the spread at 2. And I won't use streaks for this render. I'll just go ahead and render this and see what happens. Okay, so now as you can see, we have this really nice glare effect on the candle flame itself. A little bit of glare here from the top of the candle, which would be expected. What I may want to do is actually increase this resolution just a little bit. Since I'm rendering out at larger than 500 pixels, I could increase that to 1000 just to make sure that I get a nice smooth result here. But as you can see, it mainly applied that glare, or it only applied that glare to areas that where the pixel value exceeded 1.0. Now that can create a problem if, for example, you're using a 16-bit frame buffer. If I was using, and see, I'm using the 32-bit frame buffer, which allows me to go beyond a pixel value of 1.0. If I had this set up for a 16-bit frame buffer, the maximum pixel value would be 1.0, and so everywhere that is bright would be evenly lit, and you get kind of the glare effect would apply to those areas where the pixel value is 1.0, but it would be an even glare. So for the best results, use a 32-bit frame buffer with this glare shader. And so what I want to do now, I'll just enable streaks, and just so it's visible, I'll just set that to maybe 0.9 and make a copy of this image and go ahead and render that. just so that you can see what the streaks do. And also, while this is ramping up to render, let me just note that as it's rendering, you won't see that glare effect in the render. The glare effect happens in a post-rendering phase. So what you have to do is you have to let the render actually complete, and then as the last thing it will go in and apply that glare camera effect after the render is complete. So as you can see, there's no glare on this. It'll be applied once the render is actually completed. Okay, so now with that render complete, you can see the effect that the streaks option has versus the round, more just diffused glare that we had without using the streak option. You also notice a little bit darker in this image. There's not as much glare because, again, those streaks limit, you can see the pattern here, limits a lot of that glare effect. So if you use the streaks, you may actually want to increase the intensity of the glare effect. For example, I may want to increase that spread just a little bit for this particular render, but that what I have there is okay, but that's the difference between using the spread and not using the spread. What I'll do is come back and decrease that weight back down to 0.5, and I'll enable the replace rendered image with glare only and render that. And there's that render. What happens is as the render is complete, I actually went through and rendered the scene just as previously, but once the render is complete, when it applied the glare shader, it blacked out everything except for the actual glare render itself. Now you could use this if you wanted to render this out separately and apply it in a post application to have a little more control over the amount of glare. Instead of having to come back and re-render the effect each time, you could do that. Just know that this does not pop up in its own frame buffer. It just replaces the existing frame buffer. So when you have that option enabled, that replace rendered image, it's going to replace your image with this glare image. So unfortunately, you can't render out a separate. It would be nice if this rendered out in its own frame buffer so that you could keep both renders without having to lose your actual beauty render. Okay, so that's the glare shader, and that's probably the easiest way to add a realistic glow effect to your scenes when you're using Mental Ray. You do have a couple of other options here too, especially since I'm using light sources here. I could come back to the render tab and another camera shader. Let me just disable the glare shader first by turning off this output option. And what I'll do is, for a volume shader, I could use something like this beam shader. And again, I'll drag this over to the material editor as an instance copy. And you can assign which lights to have this beam effect control. But since I want it to do all lights in this particular scene, I'll just leave that unchecked, and it will apply itself to all the lights. What I do here is set up maybe a color of like kind of an orangish white for the beam effect. And while it says beam, it's not actually like a beam. This will just put a soft glow around the light sources, which in turn are located where these candle flames are. So let me just give that a render. I went ahead and stopped that particular render because you can see what's going on here. That's a volume effect, and so I'm losing the color data and all from my scene here when I apply that beam shader. So what you could do if you wanted to use that, and it would be rather fast, is what I would do is actually hide all of the geometry except for the light sources. So what I'll do is go into my scene here and select geometry, do a Control A and hide selection, and now I'm just left with the light sources. So if I go in and render that, actually let me cancel that because I won't need to calculate final gather for this, so turn that off and actually render the scene. You can see I have that glow effect that I can use if I wanted to apply that in post. Of course there's really not much fall off here on that, but I can control that in post, and it would just be a way to add a little bit of a glare if you want to do that real quick without having to actually render the scene and then apply this in a post application such as like Photoshop, or if you're using combustion or something like that, you could use this in there to add a little bit of glow where the spots where it's needed. Now, doing this actually made me think of something that I wanted to mention when talking about the glare shader. So what I want to do is kind of go back to that for just a second. Let me just do an unhide all here and come back into my, let me close that, come back into the render settings here. Let me just cut and get rid of that one. I want to go back to the glare because I want to mention that this glare picks up the colors from the objects that it's glowing, and that kind of made me remember that when I use this beam shader that I had to specify a color, and you don't have to do that with this glare shader because it picks up the color of the object that it's glare being applied to, if you will. So what I'll do is grab this material from the candle here, and I'll just make one set blue, leave one set as it is. And so what I'll do is just give this a Kelvin value of, let's say, 9,000, which is higher than the settings on my exposure control Kelvin setting. So that should turn these blue. And just apply this to the these candle flames here. Whoops, let me rename that. Pull up my frame buffer, re-enable Final Gather. I'll just set that on low and render the image again. And so what should happen this time is that I should have some blue candles over here on the right. The flames, even though they're white looking now, during the calculation phase here, the glare will actually see that color as it is, even though it's overblown in our viewport, and it should give a little bit of a blue tone to that glare effect. And so as you can see now, it automatically picked up that color of that light source. You can see that it put a little bit of a red glare here, and then we have the bluish white here coming off that. So that's one of the unique features about the glare shader that I forgot to mention, in how it actually picks up its color. There's no color option here, that it picks it up from whatever is glowing in your scenes, or actually beyond a pixel value of 1.0. So it's quite useful. Okay, so next I want to look at some of the built-in glow features. What I'll do is come in and delete the glare filter here, or this glare shader, so that we're not working with that any longer. Wipe out my frame buffer here. And what I'm going to do now is use some of the effects that some of the glow effects that were around for the scanline renderer, but they do also work in the mental ray renderer. And so what I'll do is go to rendering and effects. And as I said, this is kind of these were left over from the scanline. They actually work well in the scanline, but they also work in mental ray. So what I can do is come in and add an effect here. Let's say I want to add a lens effect. Just click OK. And down here below you can select which ones you want to add into the scene here. So for example, if I wanted a glow effect on these lights, what I could do is just add that over. And what you need to do is pick the light sources that you want to use here. And I want to use all the lights in the scene, but I still have to assign this. So what I'll do is click on the pick light, and I need to change to actual lights here. And just pick that. I have to come back and pick again and again. And as you can see, as I'm going back and picking these, it's adding it to the selection here. So I'm just going to pick all 6 lights. Now if I were to render this as it is, an error would pop up because this is not compatible with the 32-bit frame buffer available in mental ray. So for example, if I render this, you can see you get this effect, this pop-up box telling you that it's not compatible, and the reason is it's a 32-bit channel, blah blah blah. So what you have to do is switch over, unfortunately, to a 16-bit frame buffer. And I say unfortunately because that's, as I mentioned before, if you were using the glare shader, that would be kind of a bad thing to use that 16-bit frame buffer, and that it limits all the brightness is clamped at a pixel value of 1.0. So you're kind of limiting your color range by using that 16-bit frame buffer. And actually, before I render that, what I want to do is, since this is going to be applied only to these light sources, so that I can configure this quickly, a good tip is to come in and actually hide everything in the scene except what this is going to be applied to. So what I'm going to do is I've got my geometry filter selected. I'll just hit Control A to select all the geometry in the scene and just do a quick hide by right clicking and go to the hide option. And I also want to, in my frame buffer or in the render settings, I'm just going to disable Final Gather since there's nothing in the scene. And now what I can do is when I render this, I actually won't have to pause the video. It should go fairly quickly. So as you can see, this is also a post effect that happens after the render is complete. You can also see that it's kind of blurred at the moment and kind of dull, not very bright. You can adjust that, of course, with the settings here. So what I have under the parameters, let's just increase the intensity all the way, which is a limit of 500, and render that again. It's a little bit brighter. I could actually increase that further down here in the glow element section. I also have another intensity control, and it too is capped at 500. So if I increase that, and basically what I'm doing is trying to compensate this brightness for the exposure control settings that I'm using. I'm using the photographic exposure control, and so this these effects aren't really geared towards that photographic exposure control. That's why I have to increase the brightness so much here. But as you can see from the render, we're getting brighter results here. Of course, I don't want that effect that large, so I have some settings here that I can come down here to the glow effect settings. I can decrease the size, let's just say something like 5, and give that a render. And now we're getting closer to something that you'd see around candle flames. Probably need to go a little bit smaller, maybe 2. That's better. Now if I wanted to, I could change the color of this. I would have to assign colors to this, unlike using the glare shader. But what I could do is maybe give this a kind of a warm tone, and then for the radial color, maybe it fades out to something like an orange. Try that. Probably want a little bit of a darker color there for that. Another good reason of using this, or another good option when you use this, is that you can have it apply to lights or the image. You could specify an object ID, which is like a gbuffer ID. So if you wanted specific objects to have this glow effect applied to them, you could do that here. Whereas with the glare shader, you can't really specify with any of the settings that you have inside of Max. You can't specify only apply the glare shader to a certain object. There are ways to do that, but you have to download custom shaders and things. So I wasn't going to get into that here in this video, since it's I wanted to stick with what you have available to you when you just start with Max. And of course, I have options here if I wanted to specify a certain map for the radial color. Instead of these two color swatches, I could use my own custom map. If I wanted to adjust the fall-off curve between these two colors, you can do that here, either by clicking and adding some points and adjusting that, or you could also use a map here. Also quickly have this squeeze option, which will extend these along the horizontal, and if I enable that and give it a render, nothing will show up here because it's actually kind of squeeze it down too much, and you have to increase this to a higher value than 2. So let me just put that at 50. So you can see how that's more elongated now. Turn that back off and set it to 2. And what I'll do is just unhide all of the objects here, and I think I'll just leave Final Gather off and just give this a render so that we can see what that glow effect looks like actually in the scene. And there's the completed render. And as you can see, you're not going to get the realism that you had with something, say, like the glare shader. But I just wanted to show it's another effect to make, another way to make things glow inside of 3ds Max. What I can do is come back into the Effects tab here, Effects Settings. Let's take out that glow, because there's other options that you could add. You could add a ring, array, all kinds of different features here. So let me come back in and hide my geometry. And as you can see, even though I've deleted that glow effect, I've added this ring. It's still set up to use the same lights. And you can use these together, by the way. I'm just showing one by one so that you can see the effect that they have independently. Of course, what we have here is it's going to put this kind of ring around the light sources. That's actually a little bit too large. So I'm going to come down to the size settings here. Maybe decrease that to something like 12. So you can see what that's going to do, and the settings here are similar, as you can tell, to the glow effect. Again, I have the color that I could specify my own colors or maps, change the fall off, change that circular color. So let me come back up and get rid of this one and put a ray value in here. You can see what that does. And again, the options here are the same, are similar to the options on the other lens effects that we've looked at. The auto secondary, I have a little more options here with this one. So you can get into kind of a lens flare effect here with these if you wanted to do that. Of course, those are a little bit large, obviously, for the scene that I have here. In this case, if I wanted that effect smaller, I could come up to the size options here, the lens effect globals, and just decrease the size of this. Maybe something like 20. You can see smaller effects here. You have, let me just increase that back. You can have different shapes to this effect, different color settings here. Obviously you can change the color effects down here, but you also have different presets that you could use if you wanted to do that. Have a manual secondary, kind of similar settings here to the auto secondary. Kind of hard to see, but that one placed way down here off the side. I would need to adjust those settings, but it's kind of the same thing as the auto secondary, except a different set of those. I have a star option. I've always thought these look kind of similar to the that glare shader that I applied earlier. You can see those here. You could probably make some of those using this feature. Just put one light source in the center of your screen and kind of come in and configure the settings on the star to create streak patterns and things like that. But again, as you can notice, I'm not spending a lot of time going in depth on all the settings here, because you can pretty much come in and test these on your own, the settings here for each of these. But also the results that you get from these aren't terribly realistic, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. The upside is that they render quickly, but again, the results aren't typically astounding results, but they can get you by in a pinch if you don't have any compositing programs that you can add these glow effects in. And speaking along those lines, generally speaking, you probably want to add things like the glows and stuff like that outside of your renderer. Normally you'd want to do that in a post application, because as you can see, each time that I want to change some of the settings here, I have to re-render the scene, and that can cost you a lot of time. So normally what you do is actually render these in something like either Photoshop if it's for a still image, or Nuke or Combustion, some of those compositing programs, you'd probably want to add things like the streaks and the glows and stuff like that, so that you can change it in real time after the render is complete. And if it's too strong or too weak, you can just go right in and change it without having to re-render your images. So that being said, let's come in and look at the streak option here, the last one. And so that is the effects that you can add, some of these lens effects that you can add to your scenes to make objects glow. There's also another option. It's also kind of dated here. If you go to video post, what I'll need to do is I'll bring in some of the geometry back. Let me just do an unhide all, and I'll work this off of the gbuffer ID. So let me go to a perspective view and check the object ID on these flame meshes. Just right click and go to properties, and I've got the gbuffer ID set to 1 here. So let me go back to my camera view. Now I may get a crash when I'm working on this because this video posting it's kind of buggy anymore in some of the newer versions of Macs. I just think that this is such a dated application here, or feature inside of Macs, that it's kind of been neglected over the years. So if I get a crash here, don't be surprised if the video stops and it comes back and I'm at a different point in the scene. So you've been warned. Do use this. Make sure that you save your scene frequently. But to use this, what you can do is come in and add some events here. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. So what I want to do is go in and add a scene event. So I just click on this, and I'm going to assign this to camera 1 and just hit OK. And so what I want to do next is actually set up the glows to happen. So what I want to do is add a filter event. So I'll come over here to add image filter event, and you can pick which types of events that you want to occur. For this video, I'm just going to pick glow, lens effect glow, and you can come in and do a setup on this right quick. I'm actually just going to hit OK on this for now, and let me go back in, and just so that I know that it's added here to the queue, and let me just double click that, and I get the screen again and go back into the setup. And you have a preview option here where you can see what's going on here, but you can actually make things glow using this lens effect glow option. You can assign it to different object IDs or effect IDs. You can have it assigned to the whole image if you wanted to, or as I said, just certain objects in your scene where you specify. Right now I'm just going to leave it set up for object ID 1, which is these flames, candle flames in my scene, and I can turn on viewport queue, this option, and what it'll do is actually go in and render the Mac scene here in this preview. Okay, that seems to have locked up Max. I actually tried restarting. It crashed on me one time, and I restarted Max, switched that scene over to the scanline renderer to see if it worked any better, and I'm still getting a lockup on using this lens effect glow. So I can't really recommend using that as a feature in 3ds Max now in some of the newer versions. Perhaps in the older versions that's a way, but you may want to explore it and see if it works for you, but it doesn't seem too reliable these days. So with that, I will conclude the discussion on making objects glow. Just want to remind you that if you can at all, you may want to apply things like the glow effect in post, but if you're using if you have to render it out, so be it. But if you're using Mental Ray, definitely check out that glare shader, that glare lens shader, because that provides some really realistic results. And that's it.